there's a reason why I came off Twitter about 12, 13 years ago.
Because you're more intelligent than the rest of us.
I was just inundated with abuse, so I just decided to not, inflict that upon myself. But most of the other referees are on it, and fair play to them. But I didn't want to open myself up to that, albeit I did get some via other social media, but I think Twitter in particular um, invites that sort of comment. I think there were too many examples for me last year where active players, were being critical of match officials on Twitter. And that for me is unacceptable, brings the game into disrepute, and should be sanctioned by the RFL. I'm not sure how many of those cases were. I know some were, but not necessarily every one of them. And not to say that people can't have an opinion, but I think the way it's done is not great. Having said that, I think there's a place for the match officials department to speak a little bit more publicly about decisions. The fact that we've seen 3 8-point tries in 2 weeks or thereabouts, that is a talking point, and you do have to ask, well, why is that? Has there been a challenge to interpretation? And I think they would sort of say, well, we're having those discussions with the clubs, but I think the wider game probably should know that. Now, whether that's being fed through media, I don't know. But I think there should be a role for perhaps a bit better communication, so people feel that referees are never heard from, and they're not interviewed post match. And I get that, but we implemented a few years ago now. Ask the ref on Twitter, and it didn't work that well. It worked probably quite well initially, but you got somebody that sort of asked a legitimate question. You put your hand up and said, yes, we got it wrong. And then you got shot down for saying, well, you got it wrong. You should have got it right. Well, so you couldn't win in some respect. And other questions where you said, no, the decision was correct, and you explained why it was correct, they still thought you were wrong anyway. So it just didn't really work as a method. So I think there probably are ways. You're never going to convince somebody black is white and vice versa. But I think if you can set out perhaps some reasons why decisions have been given or not given. So, for example, the Walters incident the other week, that in my opinion was a mistake by the referee. It wasn't. He made a live judgment, which from his position was difficult to see whether it was a shoulder charge or not. The angles we saw were all completely different angles that showed it much more clearly. The video referee didn't give input on that occasion because he didn't feel it merited a sin bin. And so the referee and the touch judges were left to their live view of the incident. And ultimately, in my opinion, they made an error of judgment. Now, people probably don't realise that I suspect that was the conclusion out of that. Whereas, so then people are left a little bit confused of, what is that a shoulder charge or not? Do you have to rotate, for example? I think it's just providing that clarity to people. That's not to say mistakes won't happen in the future, because you have to make decisions in live play.
They've got to be perfect. We need to get AI robot referees who make no incorrect decisions, because obviously everyone on a rugby league pitch and in the stands is perfect. I mean, I know, Phil, you never make any mistakes in your match reports. You never make any spelling errors or anything, or give players the wrong mark out of 10.
All the time. It's a game of opinion. And the thing is, that's what we thrive on, that. So we shouldn't shy away from that. It's also, a game of decisions. And, as you just said, in life, you're going to make some wrong ones. But I don't think we need to apologise for that. I think we do need to explain it. And that's the thing. The other thing we've always said why we wouldn't criticise a match official is there's no one incident that ever determines a game. The later it comes in the game, the more people think it's determined the game. But clubs have 79 and a half minutes to determine their own fate. So it's not like football where games are going to end 1-0 and that 1-0 could be a penalty, and that penalty decision is the wrong decision and all the focus is on that. We have 79 and a half minutes of the clubs deciding how that game is going to go, whether they're disciplined, indisciplined, standing offside, forward passing, knocking the ball on, missing a tackle. So focusing all the time on one thing that a referee may or may not have got wrong, you've got to get away from saying that was the reason why a team won or lost. It rarely, if ever, is.
But the reality is that's never going to change. That's never going to change, because it's easy to point the finger at a decision.
And we live in a blame culture.
Yeah, and that, that's not going to change. Look, for me, it's about communicating if that decision was perceived to be wrong, just to provide clarity going forward. I listened to Willie Peters talking about game this weekend, he was he sort of said he would be seeking clarification basically around how the ruck was refereed in the application of 6 agains. Now that's slightly different because that's not a one-off decision. That's an interpretation. I suspect it was because they only received one set restart. Now I don't know how many set restarts. It was Warrington they played, wasn't it? I don't know how many set restarts they received, but what you often find is that there'll be an imbalance in that number. And so there's sometimes a pressure on referees to demonstrate balance. Now, balance doesn't mean that the numbers should be equal, not at all.
Well, possession is going to determine that.
Absolutely, but ultimately you should just referee what's in front of you. And if the set restart or the penalty count ends up lopsided, then that should reflect what's happened on the field. And you shouldn't be artificially massaging numbers just to show balance. That's not what balance is about. But it's about consistency.
4-1.
4-1 in terms of set restarts. Well, when you've only given 5 in a game, it's very easy to point at an imbalance because it's not a massive number. So what do you want it to be? 3-2, and suddenly you've got balance. So I think it's big. It's a bigger picture than that. The ruck is obviously a tricky area of the game to officiate, and it's probably tricky to have a 100% consistency from game to game. That is a tricky area. It's one-off decisions that are perhaps easier to explain and provide clarity on.
Is 6 again an advantage, or has that placed an impossible onus on referees? We want the game to be quicker, but also we're looking for reasons why an interpretation is slowing that game down. And to a fan, interpretation is never good because we think it's the referee showing a favouritism rather than there's a rule or a law. It's been broken. It's a high tackle. It's a shoulder charge, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I've seen a bit of criticism recently about set restarts. For me, I think they work well. It does give greater flow to the game. But I think sometimes when you're at a game live, you may not understand why it's being given. When you watch it probably on the TV, you probably have a better view of that individual ruck. But in the old days when a penalty was given for hand on the ball, did you have any more idea that a penalty was given for hand on the ball than a set restart being given? You'd argue, well, the referee gave a signal, so you'd look at the signal for what that particular ruck offence was. Was it a leg pull? Was it a hand on ball, for example? You'd see a signal. Yeah, that perhaps provides some clarity, but I think overall the set restart system works. You would still have coaches saying there's an inconsistency in the application of penalties for ruck interference, whether that was a penalty or a set restart. So I don't think it's changed.
I think it's about slowing down the ruck, that certain teams are perceived to hold on to the absolute maximum and don't get penalised for a set or don't get a penalty against them, whereas other teams that are seen to be playing the ball quickly, then their fans start getting upset at the fact that they're being prevented from doing that. I think having acting halfbacks who are constantly waving their arm around doesn't help.
Well, in terms of referees' review, each game is statted independently by Opta or Perform, I think they're now called. They stat the games in terms of ruck speeds. They stat the 10 metres, so the referee's scored in terms of his own review on his accuracy of setting his 10 metres, and is scored in terms of the speed of the ruck. And you'll be able to see whether there is an imbalance in speed between one team or another. That may not be attributable necessarily to the referee. That ruck timing is split between initial contact and the tackle being completed. That's phase 1. And then phase 2 is once the tackle's called as being completed to the ball being played. So that's phase 2. Phase 2 is something that the referee probably controls a little bit more because he calls when the tackle's completed and then the ball's played. The first phase, initial contact to the move call, is trickier because if you get a game that's more upright tackles, then you're going to have slower rucks because players will probably be held upright initially for a split second before being put on the ground. And some coaches will still talk about trying to prevent this upright tackling, but every change has a knock-on effect. So if you try and prevent the upright tackles, you potentially limit the offloads. And the offloads, for me, create a different dynamic to the game, take away a little bit of structure, and players then start playing a little bit more off the cuff. So for every change you make, it has a knock-on effect. And for some coaches, it suits their style and their playing squad, and for others, it doesn't. So the game as a whole, when they make changes like that, have to think about what's best in the best interest for the game overall. And I would say set restarts work well as they do.
You see, you talk about explanation. There you have it. I shall never complain about a 6 again.
I'm sure you will.
No, but I understand now the theory behind it, which I'm not sure has been explained from. You can put it down as this is how we're going to administer it. But when you talk about it in practice on the field, suddenly it makes a hell of a lot more sense.
I think one of the main reasons it was introduced was you saw certain teams, particularly on the defensive line, on the goal line, willing to just concede a penalty because that allowed them to reset their line. Whereas actually a set restart doesn't allow you to do that. You're still against a scrambling defence, and suddenly you've gone from tackle 4 to tackle 0, and you've got to defend that set. And that's really the main reason why it was brought in, to stop those teams from deliberately slowing the game down, resetting the line. And I think that's worked.
I also think what's worked is giving more penalties at scrums for offside that are no longer differential penalties, because teams were standing up offside to stop scrum moves. And I think we've seen more penalties this year.
But I don't know whether that's true. You may have seen proportionately more penalties, but I think that's because more teams have decided to trap the ball in the second row. Now, they would argue it's to bring the scrum half round to allow that attacking opportunity, and I've seen that on a few occasions, and it's worked effectively. There was a scrum try in the Huddersfield game. It wasn't perhaps in that situation. There were 2 in the Hull Cast game in round 1 when I was there. So that's working perhaps a little bit more. And the change of the law where teams were allowed to bring the scrum to the centre field has allowed that opportunity to open up. But, for me, I think it's partly to do with the players and less to do with the referees. I don't think the referees are applying the offside law on scrums any differently to than when they did last year. It's just that the way that teams are playing now is different. More teams are being caught out perhaps early on with going a little bit early on the scrum. I think as they get used to that, they'll probably be a little bit more disciplined to hold that line.
James is the youngest person here. Phil, do you remember when they actually put the ball in the scrum in the middle?
I remember hookers being sent off. For technical offences, it was called. I've no idea. Dark arts.
Well, we definitely don't want to go to those days, do we? We don't want scrums that last five minutes.
Or 70 in a game, which we had at one stage. We used to think that was entertainment.
If we want to do that, we can watch something else. But